In this video today, I'm going to be talking about release triggers and flinching. See you in a second. Alright, so release triggers and flinching I feel like are two of the most kind of interesting and intriguing topics in trap shooting because there can be so many different things behind them. So for example, on release triggers, it can be tricky to know when you need to go shoot a release trigger. What all are some of the obstacles that you'll face whenever you switch to shooting a release trigger, and what's the subtle differences between a release trigger and a pull trigger. And the same thing with flinching. What causes a flinch and how long do they last? How do you overcome them? There's several different things here, several different dilemmas that you can face if you're either having a problem with a flinch or looking going into a release trigger. Now, more than likely, these two topics really go together because pretty much the only reason you'd be looking at a release trigger is if you are having a problem with a flinch. So let's go ahead and start with the topic of a release trigger. For those of you that may not know what a release trigger is basically just a trigger. Instead of pulling it back, you pull it and then you release it to fire the gun. So whenever you would mount the gun, you would go ahead and pull the trigger and call for the target, and then whenever you're ready to fire, you go ahead and release it as opposed to pulling it. And it's a pretty simple trigger to operate. I actually had one on my gun at one time. Whenever I first bought my Krieghoff, it came with a release trigger, but I had it switched to a pull trigger just because I don't really have flinch issues, and that's what I'm more comfortable with is the pull trigger. So the release trigger is something that you're going to go to if you're having issues with a flinch. Now that brings me into the next topic, which is flinching. So flinching is something that I think every shooter has probably done at some point, most shooters anyway. I know I've done it in the past, I've had issues with it. Most of the time for me, what I found is it's either A, I'm not completely comfortable in what I'm visually seeing, or B, somehow I get something weird in my stance, so I'm just not moving right. Really, flinching is just where you go up to the target and you do this thing where you can't pull the trigger and you kind of dive down, or maybe you just kind of move at the last second. And that's what flinching is. I remember I used to struggle with this sometimes on the first target in doubles particularly, just because I wasn't seeing the target well because I had my hold point too high. So I was flinching because I just wasn't comfortable with the situation. So my adjustment was to lower my hold point a little bit, just enough to give me enough time to really lock onto the target, and it fixed the issue, and I haven't dealt with any flinching issues in forever. I mean, it's been years. So I think that everybody's going to have a different thing that can cause their flinch. For me, it was just a slight mistake in my hold point, which was causing a visual issue, which was causing me not to be comfortable with the situation, which ultimately made me flinch. Like I said, sometimes it can be your stance a little bit off, where you're getting kind of locked up whenever you're going over to the target, and then you're flinching a little bit because of that. And for some people, it's because they've shot for so long, and they've shot for so many years, and they've shot so many shells that it just kind of causes them to have this reaction where they flinch. You see a lot of the older, more veteran shooters, they have this issue, so they have to go to a release trigger. I actually had a friend that just had this issue, and he switched to a release trigger, and he's done very well for himself with that. So it's definitely not something to be afraid of if you have to make that switch over to a release trigger. I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It just kind of depends on the situation. So I wouldn't make the switch if I didn't have to. If I'm not having any problems with a pull trigger, I'm not going to switch over to a release trigger. So it's not a bad thing to switch to a release trigger, but it's not really a good thing unless you're needing to do it. If you're having a problem, then go ahead and switch to a release trigger if you can't fix it. But if you're not having any problems, then I wouldn't recommend doing it. I would recommend just staying with that pull trigger and using that because that's what you're comfortable with. The last thing I want to talk about is some of the issues you may face if you are switching over to a release trigger. So the first thing you're going to notice is basically you're going to have to relearn how to pull the trigger, because you've pulled the trigger for your whole life, and all of a sudden you're releasing the trigger. So it's totally a change in what you're used to. So you're going to have to relearn how to fire the gun, which is going to take a few shells. It's going to take a little bit of time to get comfortable with that. It's going to take a little bit of time to fully understand and wrap your mind around that. The other issue that I see with a release trigger that you're going to have to overcome, and this is probably the more common one, the more notable one that I feel like happens, is if once you pull that trigger, you can't just release it and pull your gun down. You have to actually break open your gun and then you can pull it down. An example of this would be, let's say that you're ready, you're mounted the gun, you have the trigger pulled back right before you get ready to call for the target, and then you call for the target and the machine throws a broken target and it's throwing several broken targets and you have to pull your gun down. Well, you can't just take your hand off the gun because that would fire the gun. You actually have to break open the gun and then pull it down. So that can be something that you're going to have to learn, kind of a safety issue there, because obviously you don't want to go firing a gun whenever you don't mean to, whenever you're not firing at a target. And so you have to kind of learn that and be aware of that situation. It's just something else that you're going to have to remember and keep in your mind. It's not necessarily a huge deal, but it is a learning experience that you're going to have to think about and ultimately figure out how you want to handle that situation. So that's pretty much it for this one, guys. That's my thoughts on a release trigger and on flinching. They're both two pretty popular topics that are discussed, two pretty heavily debated issues. That's my thoughts on them. I think that the release trigger is a good thing. If you need to switch, then go ahead and use it. Flinching can be overcome sometimes, especially if you're a younger guy like me and you have a flinch. It's probably not from the fact that you've shot so many shells over so many years. It's probably just something you're doing wrong in your technique. So I definitely would look at that before I go to a release trigger. Let me know your thoughts. What's your experience on a release trigger versus a pull trigger? Maybe you had to switch to a release trigger. How has it helped you? Let me know that down in the comment section down below. You can subscribe to my channel here. You can check out a couple more videos here. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.